The day the Velthari fleet appeared above Earth, nobody panicked. That surprised them. I think that surprised them more than anything else that came after. I was standing on the observation deck of Meridian Station. That's the joint human-alien diplomatic hub orbiting about 400 kilometers above the North Atlantic, when the sensors lit up. 17 capital ships, Velthari war class, the kind of vessels that had made 11 other species surrender before the first shot was fired. The Velthari liaison on deck, a tall gray-scaled being named Commander Sarath Voss, watched the human crew's reaction with what I can only describe as professional confusion. Nobody screamed, nobody ran. Sergeant First Class Dina Reyes, who had been eating a granola bar and reviewing maintenance logs, looked up at the sensor display, set down her granola bar and said, and I'm quoting directly, 17. That's more than last time. Then she picked up her granola bar again and reached for her comm unit. Sarath Voss stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to me and said, in that flat translated voice all Velthari used, "Your soldier is not afraid." I thought about it. She's annoyed, I said. Those are different things. He didn't understand what I meant then. He would. My name is Marcus Elian Webb. I was 39 years old when this happened. My official title was Senior Diplomatic Liaison, Human Galactic Affairs Division, but what that really meant was that I was the person the Galactic Council called when something went wrong with humans, and I was the person humans called when something went wrong with the Galactic Council. I'd held the position for 6 years. In that time, I had managed 47 incidents, trade disputes, border violations, 3 separate cases of alien species accidentally consuming human food products that turned out to be mildly toxic to them, which produced some very uncomfortable diplomatic conversations. A misunderstanding between a Quelari merchant vessel and a U.S. Navy destroyer that almost became a war. None of those had prepared me for what the Velthari did on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Let me give you the background, because context matters here. The Velthari were not the most powerful species in the galaxy. They weren't even top 5, but they were what you'd call aggressively mid-tier, meaning they were powerful enough to bully smaller civilizations, fast enough to run from bigger ones, and clever enough to pick fights they were reasonably sure they could win. They'd been doing it for about 300 years. They had a system. They'd arrive at a newly contacted species home system, display force, make demands, and the species, usually terrified, usually technologically inferior, usually completely alone in a cold and enormous universe, would comply. They called it Veth Karos. In Velthari, it roughly translates to the accounting, the process of determining what a lesser species owes to a greater one for the privilege of existing in galactic space. Earth had been contacted by the Galactic Council 14 years earlier. We'd gone through the standard intake process. We'd signed the baseline accords. We'd sent ambassadors and received them. We'd joined trade networks and submitted to atmospheric monitoring and done all the things newly inducted species were supposed to do. But we'd also quietly started building a fleet. Not to be aggressive. I want to be clear about that. Earth's defense doctrine at that point was still firmly reactive, but we'd been watching the galaxy for 14 years and we'd noticed the pattern. We'd noticed what happened to species that showed up without armor, and we'd started making armor. The Velthari, apparently, had noticed us noticing, and they decided to act before we got too big. So, 17 capital ships, Tuesday afternoon, and Sergeant First Class Dina Reyes eating a granola bar without losing her composure. I got to the main diplomatic bay about 12 minutes after the fleet appeared. The room was controlled chaos, that particular flavor of intense, focused activity that military and diplomatic personnel do when things are going sideways and they've trained for it. People were at stations. Comm channels were open. Captain Irene Sato, who commanded Meridian Station, was standing at the central console with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who is extremely tired but will not be allowing that to interfere with her work. "Status," I said, coming to stand beside her. 17 Velthari warships in geosynchronous orbit above the station. They've opened a comm channel. They're waiting. She glanced at me sideways. They demanded to speak to whoever is in charge of human territory. Did you tell them that's about 200 different people, depending on how you define the question? I told them we were connecting them to our senior diplomatic representative. A pause. That's you, Webb. Wonderful. I straightened my jacket. What do we know? They transmitted a document about 4 minutes ago. Our translators are still working on the full version, but the gist is, she stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. They're invoking Veth Karos. They're demanding that Earth submit a tribute package within 72 hours. Tribute. Resources, technology, territorial access. She handed me a tablet, and they've included a secondary demand. I looked at the tablet. I read the secondary demand. I read it again. Personnel, I said. 20 individuals, Sato said. Her voice was very flat, very controlled. To be selected from the human population and transferred to Velthari custody for, and I'm quoting the translation, service integration and educational processing. The room had gone very quiet. Not because people had stopped working, they hadn't, but because that particular quality of quiet had settled over everyone, where you're aware that something has crossed a line, and your body knows it before your brain finishes processing. How young? I asked. Sato looked at me. The document specifies developmental cycle stages. Our translators cross-referenced with standard galactic age equivalencies. Another pause. Between 8 and 14 years old. Nobody in that room was a particularly emotional person. You don't get to this level of work by being easily rattled. But I watched 3 separate people's faces do something in that moment. A quick, involuntary thing, before professional discipline reasserted itself. I set the tablet down very carefully. Get me the channel, I said. The Velthari commander's name was General Orth Vaughn. I want to describe him accurately, because how he looked matters for understanding what happened later. He was tall, even by Velthari standards, maybe 7 feet, with that particular reptilian-adjacent body structure they have. Scales ranging from deep green to almost black along his dorsal surfaces and fading to gray-white along his throat and chest. His eyes were amber with vertical pupils, and they had that quality a lot of Velthari eyes have, the impression of someone calculating distances. How far to strike, how fast to retreat, constantly measuring. He had 3 other officers visible behind him on the channel, military posture, weapons visible. The kind of deliberate display of armed capability that the Velthari used the way some people use cologne, as a statement about themselves before a word was spoken. He looked at me when the channel opened. That calculating gaze swept over me in about 2 seconds, cataloged what I was, and I could see the conclusion he reached, small, soft, unarmed, not a threat before he spoke. You are the human diplomat, he said through the translation filter. Flat, declarative, not a question. Senior Liaison Marcus Webb, Human Galactic Affairs. Yes, I kept my voice neutral. General Vaughn, I've received your transmission. Then you understand the terms. I understand what you've written, I said. I want to discuss the secondary demand. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. Velthari faces don't move the way human ones do, but something. The personnel provision is standard in Veth Karos protocol. It is non-negotiable. The personnel provision specifies children, I said. Young specimens, yes. They integrate more efficiently into service roles. Their behavioral plasticity. General, I stopped him, not loudly, not with heat in my voice, just stopped him. I want to make sure we understand each other before this conversation goes further. You're asking us to hand over human children. 20 individuals in early developmental stages. Yes. The Velthari Empire has extensive experience managing. I heard you, I said. I want to make sure you hear me. You are asking us to give you our children. Vaughn paused. I think the repetition confused him. Why was I saying the same thing twice? What was the point? He was calibrated for a different kind of conversation. Fear, negotiation, capitulation. The gradual process of breaking something until it agreed. He wasn't calibrated for someone who needed him to understand the weight of what he just said. The terms are non-negotiable, he said again. I'm going to need 72 hours, I told him. A flicker, almost satisfaction. They always granted the 72 hours. It was part of the Veth Karos process. The lesser species asked for time and the Velthari allowed it because the time wasn't really for deliberation. It was for the lesser species to spiral, to panic, to look at the warships above them and understand that there was no choice. 72 hours, Vaughn confirmed, at the expiration of which, if tribute and personnel are not delivered to our receiving vessel. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I understand, I said. The channel closed. I stood there for a moment after the screen went dark. The controlled chaos of the room had acquired a different texture. People were still working, still focused, but there was something underneath it now. Something that had nothing to do with training or discipline or professionalism. Webb, Captain Sato came to stand beside me. Her voice was low. What do you need? 2 things, I said. First, I need a secure channel to Earth. Defense Command, the Secretary General's office, and Admiral Chen's office simultaneously. I looked at her. And I need someone to find Colonel Hargrove. Something shifted in her expression. Hargrove. Yes. A pause. Webb, if we bring Hargrove into this. They asked for our children, Sato. My voice was still even. I was working very hard to keep it even. They told us to hand over children between the ages of 8 and 14 for service integration. So yes, we're bringing in Hargrove. Sato looked at me for another moment. Then she nodded once and turned to her crew. Get me Earth on a secure line, she said, and somebody find the Colonel. I should tell you about Colonel Hargrove. Her full name was Colonel Yusra Hargrove, and she commanded the Meridian Station contingent of the 1st Joint Response Division, which was the human military's specialized unit for galactic-level threat response. She was 51 years old. She was about 5'4". She had close-cropped silver hair and the kind of steady dark eyes that made people feel, when she was looking at them, that she was seeing not just what they were but what they were about to do. I had worked alongside Hargrove for 4 years. In that time, I had watched her de-escalate a situation involving 3 armed Quelari soldiers and a malfunctioning airlock using only calm words and a detailed knowledge of Quelari social hierarchies. I had watched her talk a panicking junior diplomat out of a decision that would have started a trade war. I had watched her, on one memorable occasion, face down a Tharkan enforcer, a species built like a small tank and famously short on patience, by standing absolutely still and silent while he threatened her for about 45 seconds, and then saying, quietly, that she would give him one opportunity to revise his approach. The Tharkan had, very slowly, revised his approach. Hargrove walked into the diplomatic bay about 6 minutes after Sato put out the call. She was in her duty uniform. She had a coffee, actual coffee, not the synthetic kind which she always seemed to have somehow, and she looked at me with those steady eyes and said, 17 ships. 17 ships, I confirmed, and a demand. I handed her the translated document. She read it. She turned the tablet over in her hands, read it again, and then set it down on the console beside her coffee. She stood very still for a moment. Children, she said. Yes. They want us to give them children. Between 8 and 14, 20 of them. Another moment of stillness. I'd learned to read Hargrove's stillness. It wasn't absence, it was concentration. She was very busy when she was that still. Marcus, she said, using my first name, which she almost never did in a professional context. Has Vaughn been briefed on human development, human culture, she stopped, started differently. Does he understand what he's asking? I don't think so, I said. I think he's done this 11 times before and this is just, I looked for the word, protocol. To him, it's protocol. Hargrove picked up her coffee, took a sip, set it down again. 72 hours, she said. Yes. The faintest shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but the ghost of something. Then we have work to do. What I want to try to explain, and this is hard to translate into words that carry the right weight, is what that 72 hours felt like from inside. The Velthari, as I mentioned, designed the 72 hours as a pressure instrument. The idea was that you spent those hours contemplating the warships above you and the history of what happened to species that said no. And by the time the deadline arrived, you were broken enough to comply. We did not spend those 72 hours like that. The first 4 hours were documentation and legal review. Our JAG officers and the civilian legal team went through the Veth Caro's provisions in exhaustive detail, not looking for loopholes exactly, but building a complete picture of exactly what was and wasn't technically permissible under Galactic Council law as it currently stood. The honest answer, which I knew going in and which the legal review confirmed, was the Velthari were inside the letter of the law. Veth Caro's was a recognized galactic protocol. Personnel tributes had been demanded before. The Council had never formally prohibited them. What the Council had also never done was deal with a species like us. Hours 4 through 12 were spent on communications, Earthside, across every relevant authority, in the most intense and least dramatic series of conversations I had ever participated in. I want to be clear that there was no hysteria. There was no political grandstanding, no shouting, no crisis movie moment where somebody pounded the table and demanded war. What there was instead was a very focused, very cold series of conversations between people who had spent their careers preparing for exactly this kind of moment, working through options with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood the stakes completely. The consensus by about hour 12 was, we were not giving them the children. That wasn't a political decision. It wasn't even, really, a strategic one. It was something older and more fundamental than both of those things. It was the decision you make when something crosses a line that isn't written in any law because it's written somewhere else, somewhere below law, in bone and blood and the particular fierce heat that kindles in the human chest when something threatens the small ones. We were not giving them the children. The question was what we were going to do instead. During those 72 hours, I had a number of conversations with Sarath Voss, the Velthari liaison who'd been stationed on Meridian Station for about 8 months as part of a standard diplomatic rotation. Voss was interesting, younger than Vaughn, and different in the way that sometimes you meet a member of a species and understand that the species contains multitudes. He wasn't a true believer in the Veth Caro's doctrine. I'd worked with him long enough to sense that. He followed it because it was the structure he'd been raised inside. But there was a quality of genuine curiosity in him that most Velthari I'd met didn't have. About 30 hours in, he found me in the observation lounge. I was watching Earth turn below us, the curve of the Atlantic, the cloud cover over Europe, the faint shimmer of city lights on the night side, and drinking terrible station coffee. He stood beside me for a while without speaking. That was something I'd come to appreciate about Voss. He understood that silence could be companionable rather than tactical. "You're Colonel Hargrove," he said finally. "She has been in the communications bay for," a pause while he calculated, 14 hours without sleeping. That's not unusual for her. She does not appear distressed. She's not distressed, she's working. Another silence. Then, Webb, the children demand. He stopped. What about it? I want you to know. He stopped again. He seemed to be choosing words with unusual care, which was not typical Velthari communication style. I was not consulted about the inclusion of the personnel provision in the final document. I looked at him sideways. I know that, Voss. Do you? I've been doing this job for 6 years, I said. I know the difference between an official position and a personal one. He was quiet for a moment, then he said something I didn't expect. What will happen, he asked, to our ships when the 72 hours end? I turned to look at him fully. He was looking at Earth. His amber eyes reflected the blue curve of it. I don't know exactly, I said honestly. But you are not going to give them the children. No, I said, we're not. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had that rare quality, rare for Velthari, at least of something like honesty stripped of performance. In the 11 previous Veth Caro's actions, he said, there were personnel provisions in 6 of them. All 6 were complied with. A pause. I reviewed the records. 3 of those species included developmental stage individuals in their tribute packages. I know, I said. Your species is different, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an observation, almost careful, like he was saying something he was still working out the shape of. Yes, I said. He looked back at Earth for a while. I think General Vaughn doesn't believe that, he said finally. He will, I said. The meeting happened at hour 68. I'd requested a secondary channel with Vaughn, not to renegotiate exactly, but because there was something I wanted to show him before the deadline hit. Something I thought he needed to see. He granted it, which told me he was still in Veth Caro's mode, confident, unhurried, processing this as a routine operation where the human panic would crystallize into compliance in the last few hours. I was in the diplomatic bay. Hargrove was standing at my right shoulder, just barely off-screen. Captain Sato was at her station. The room was calm. Vaughn's face appeared on the screen. Same assessing gaze. Same vertical pupils measuring distance. Webb, he said, you have 4 hours remaining. I know, I said. I wanted to have a conversation first. Negotiation of the terms is not. Not a negotiation, I said. A conversation, there's a difference. I paused. General, I want to ask you something. In your research on humanity, in whatever intelligence your fleet gathered before you arrived, what did you learn about how we treat our children? A slight narrowing of those amber eyes. Developmental stage individuals are a standard resource allocation target in Veth Caro's protocol. Their integration value. That's not what I asked, I said. I asked what you learned about how we treat them. A pause. I could see him recalibrating, trying to figure out the angle, the tactic. Your species has protective social structures around developmental stage individuals, standard for social mammals. This is protective social structures, I repeated. I said it the way you'd repeat something if you were trying to understand a translation issue. Can I tell you something that's not in whatever intelligence report you're working from? He waited. About 6,000 years ago, I said, human beings started building a particular kind of structure. We called them different things in different languages: walls, stockades, fortifications. And the number one thing those structures were built to protect, in every culture on every continent without exception. I let a beat pass. Children. We built our earliest fortifications around our children. Before we built them around food stores, before we built them around weapons caches, before we built them around anything else. Vaughn's expression was carefully neutral. This is historical. I'm not done, I said. He stopped. In the last 100 years of human warfare, the most destructive century in our history, do you know what the universal rule was? The one rule that every side in every conflict, no matter how brutal, at least paid lip service to another beat. You don't target children. You can violate every other convention of war. People have. People did. But you don't touch the children. Because, and this is the part I need you to understand, General, because if you touch the children, you don't get compliance. You don't get surrender. You don't get tribute. I paused. You get us, all of us, without reservation, without the parts that usually make us pause. Something was happening in Vaughn's face, subtle. The way water changes texture when the wind shifts. The surface doesn't look completely different, but something has moved underneath. You are attempting to use emotional appeal too. I'm giving you information, I said. Accurate information, that's my job. I tilted my head slightly. General, I want you to think about what I've just told you, and then I want you to look at your operational history with our species over the last 14 years and ask yourself whether we have ever, in any engagement, in any encounter, behaved like a species that responds to threats the way other species do. A longer pause. There was the Quelari incident, said one of his officers quietly from behind him. Vaughn turned slightly. A short exchange in Velthari that my translation filter caught in fragments. The ship, the human soldiers, they did not. I waited. When Vaughn turned back, something had changed. Not much, but something. You are saying you will not comply, he said. I'm saying, I replied carefully, that you have 4 hours to make a choice, and I'm giving you information that I think is relevant to making it well. He looked at me for a long moment, those amber eyes, that calculating quality. Then he closed the channel. Hargrove moved to stand beside me. He'll need time to check the Quelari incident files, she said. I know. If he checks them and still doesn't. He'll check them, I said. Vaughn is a lot of things, but he's not stupid. I rubbed my face. He's going to find the operational record. He's going to see what happened when those Quelari soldiers tried to use human civilians as shields in the Vega Station incident. He's going to see how long it took the response team to neutralize the threat, how many human casualties there were, and then he's going to see what happened to the Quelari unit afterward. A pause. What happened? Asked a younger staff member nearby. She'd been with us only about 3 months, hadn't been cleared for the full Quelari files. Hargrove glanced at her. The Quelari unit that took human hostages numbered 47 individuals, she said. 11 escaped, 36 did not. The human response team was operating under fire from multiple directions, in a depressurized environment with 12 civilian hostages in the room. A pause. It took them 9 minutes. The young staff member stared. 9 minutes, Hargrove said again quietly, and they brought out all 12 hostages alive. Silence. That, I said, is what Vaughn is going to find. He called back at hour 70. 2 hours before the deadline. I took the channel. His face appeared on screen, and I want to be precise about this because it matters. He looked different. Not dramatically. Not in the way of someone who has been visibly shaken. The Velthari are not a demonstrative species, but there was something in his bearing, in the quality of the stillness around him, that had changed. Later, Sarath Voss described it to me. He looked pale, Voss said, and I blinked because it was such a human descriptor, and then I understood. Velthari color response is in their scale saturation, not their blood. When they're under physiological stress, fear, shock, the animal equivalent of blood draining from the face, their scales lose pigment. They don't turn white. They turn gray. Vaughn, when he called back, was noticeably grayer than he had been 2 hours before. Webb, he said. General. A pause that had a different quality than his earlier pauses, less strategic, more genuine. I have reviewed the incident records your council archives have on human military response protocols. All right, I said. specifically the Quillari Vega Station incident. And 3 others. Another pause. I also reviewed the behavioral records from First Contact Protocol, the initial assessment of your species conducted 14 years ago. I'm familiar with it, I said. The First Contact behavioral assessment was a standard document. We'd seen it. Some of it was accurate. Some of it was embarrassingly wrong. The assessment rated your species as a Category 3 threat level, Vaughn said, based on technological capability at the time of contact. A very slight pause. It did not address the secondary threat indicators. Which indicators are those? I asked, though I suspected I knew. He looked at me. Social cohesion under threat, he said. Threat escalation behavior when core social bonds are targeted. Retention of tactical function under extreme duress. Another pause, and this one had something in it I genuinely didn't expect from a Velthari general, something that might almost be called honest. Willingness to sustain casualties at a rate that other species would classify as species-ending, in defense of selected individuals. The room was very quiet. General, I said, humanity has a word for it. We have several, actually, but the most accurate one is probably the oldest one. A pause. We call it love, and I know that doesn't translate well. I know your assessment protocols don't have a threat level category for it. But I want you to understand, I met his gaze directly through the screen across the distance. There is no force in this galaxy that is going to make us hand over our children. Not 17 ships, not 17 fleets, not anything. Vaughn was silent. That's not a threat, I said. It's information. I'm doing my job. He looked at me for a very long moment. Then the personnel provision, he said slowly, will be withdrawn. I kept my face still, professional, neutral. Inside, something that had been coiled very tightly in my chest for 70 hours began, very carefully, to uncoil. I think that's a wise decision, I said. It wasn't over then, of course. Nothing is ever that clean. The Velthari didn't simply pack up and leave. There were 36 more hours of back and forth on the remaining Veth Caro's terms, the resource demands, the territorial access requests, the whole complicated architecture of the tribute system. The Galactic Council got involved. There was a formal review process. The Earth legal team, who had been preparing for this for those initial 72 hours and then kept preparing, submitted a challenge to Veth Caro's applicability on the grounds of several specific Galactic Charter provisions that I'm going to spare you the details of because they're genuinely boring to explain. But the short version is, we had been doing our homework for 14 years, and our legal team was exceptional. The Veth Caro's demand was ultimately reduced to a token resource exchange, basically face-saving for Vaughn on the political level, and formally declined by Earth on the grounds of Charter Provision 14.7c, which the Council review upheld in a decision that took about 3 weeks and went in our favor 5-2. The personnel provision was never formally re-raised. But that's the official history, the legal record. That's not what I actually want to tell you about. What I want to tell you about happened on day 4. After the personnel provision was withdrawn, after the channel with Vaughn closed, after the immediate crisis had shifted from its sharpest point. I was in the corridor outside the communications bay, leaning against the wall, doing nothing in particular, just standing there, because sometimes your body needs a moment to catch up to the fact that the acute danger has passed. And Hargrove found me there. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, both of them. I don't know how she maintained that supply, and I'd learned not to ask. She handed me one and leaned against the wall beside me. We stood like that for a while, saying nothing. The station hummed around us, the deep, constant vibration of the engines, the smaller sounds of life support and systems maintenance. My daughter is 9, Hargrove said. I looked at her. She lives with her dad in Wellington. Hargrove was looking at the wall across from us. Her voice was completely even, completely steady. She wants to be a marine biologist. She's obsessed with octopuses. She knows things about octopus cognition that I genuinely don't understand. A very small pause. She asked me last month why I go away so much. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her I keep the station running. Another small pause. That's close enough. I nodded. When I saw that document, she said, the personnel provision, she stopped, started again. I've been in this job long enough to have a particular kind of control over my reactions. It's trained, it's useful, I believe in it. A pause. And then I saw that document, and for about 8 seconds. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I know, I said. We stood there for another moment. Good outcome, she said finally. Good outcome, I agreed. She finished her coffee and straightened up from the wall. Back to Colonel Hargrove, professional and precise. The colonel who'd kept 14 hours in the communications bay without sleep and had not appeared distressed. She walked away down the corridor. I stood there a little longer, holding my coffee, looking at nothing. 2 days later, Sarath Voss requested a meeting with me. We met in the small conference room off the observation deck, the one with the actual window, not a screen, so you could see the real sky and the real darkness beyond it. The Velthari fleet was still there. They'd begun a slow withdrawal, but it wasn't complete. Voss came in and sat down across from me. He had that careful quality I'd noticed in him, unusual for his species, that careful way of occupying space. I requested this meeting, he said, because I want to ask you something that is outside my official parameters. All right, I said. The personnel provision, he stopped, the children. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. In my career, in Velthari diplomatic service, in 14 years of assignments, I have been part of 3 previous Veth Karo's actions. He paused. 2 of them included personnel provisions. I participated in the documentation, the communications, the receiving of the tribute. He looked up at me. The species that complied, what they transferred, I wrote the reports. His voice was still even, but something underneath it was not. I used the protocol language, developmental stage individuals, integration subjects, the language that makes it, he stopped. The language that makes it possible to do it, I said quietly. Yes, he looked at me. After seeing what happened here, after seeing your Colonel Hargrove, your people, the way you, he stopped again. I want to know what the other species, the ones that complied, what they were thinking, whether he couldn't seem to find the end of the sentence. I thought about how to answer that. I sat with it for a moment before I spoke. I think, I said carefully, that they were probably doing the same math we were. 17 ships. The history of what happened to species that said no. The absolute logic of survival. I paused. I think they looked at the math, and they made a calculation. And you didn't, he said. We made a different calculation, I said. Or, I thought about it. No, actually, we stopped calculating. I looked at him. That's the thing about children, Voss. When it comes to them, we stop being rational. It's not a strategy. It's not doctrine. It's just what we are, what we've always been. A pause. Maybe that sounds like weakness to a species that runs on pure calculation. No, Voss said quietly. No, it doesn't. We sat for a moment. The other species, he said, the ones that complied, I have thought about them a great deal in the past 4 days. I imagine you have, I said. I have submitted a formal request, he said, to the Galactic Council to review the personnel provision usage in previous Veth Karo's applications and the status of the individuals transferred. He paused. The developmental stage individuals. I looked at him. I don't know if it will be granted, he said, or what will happen if it is. I think that took courage, I said, doing that. He looked at me with those amber eyes, the calculating quality still there, but something else alongside it now. Your species has changed my assessment of what courage is, he said. I thought it was the willingness to take personal risk in combat. I thought it was what your soldiers have. The 9 minutes, he paused. I think it might also be something else. Smaller. Less. He searched for the word. Less visible. I thought about Hargrove, leaning against the wall with her coffee, talking about her daughter and the octopuses. Yes, I said, I think you're right. The last official meeting with General Vaughn happened on day 7, via channel, as the fleet completed its withdrawal. Protocol required a formal closing statement from both sides. It's routine, a diplomatic acknowledgement that the interaction has concluded, a brief summary of agreed terms, a mutual expression of continued Galactic Council participation. Vaughn went through it. He was precise, professional, and gave absolutely nothing away. By the time the statement was done, I almost wondered if I'd imagined the gray quality of his scales 4 days ago, the thing that had changed in his face when he called back 2 hours before the deadline. Then, when the formal statement was concluded, there was a pause before the channel closed, just a beat, in which nothing should have happened because the formal portion was done. Vaughn said, Webb. General, I said. Another pause. The personnel provision, he said. I included it because it was standard protocol. I know, I said. I did not, he stopped. He was a Velthari general. He had 7 feet of height and 17 capital ships behind him and 300 years of imperial history. He was not, constitutionally, the kind of being who said what he was about to say. And yet, I did not fully consider what I was asking. The room was very still. I understand that now, he said. I let a moment pass, let it settle. I appreciate you saying that, I said finally, General. He looked at me for one more moment, then the channel closed. Earth officially filed its charter challenge 48 hours later. The Veth Caro's review took 3 weeks, as I mentioned, and went in our favor. More significantly, and this took about 2 more years to fully develop, the Voss request to the Galactic Council to review previous personnel provision cases opened an investigation that eventually led to the recovery and return of 63 individuals from 5 different species who had been taken under Veth Caro's tribute requirements in previous decades. The investigation also resulted in Galactic Council Resolution 774, which formally prohibited personnel tribute of any kind in all recognized protocols, including developmental stage individuals, including children. I was in the council chamber when Resolution 774 passed. The vote was 11-1. The one dissent was the Velthari Council representative, which was expected, and even that, we were told informally, almost didn't happen. The vote inside the Velthari diplomatic corps on whether to dissent or abstain had apparently been close. I thought about Voss when I heard that. A year after all of this, I got a personal message from Sarath Voss. He'd been reassigned from Meridian Station shortly after the Veth Caro's incident. Not a punishment exactly, more of a quiet relocation. He'd been posted to a small station in the outer systems, doing routine work, the kind of posting that is given to people who have made themselves inconvenient to the established order. The message was short. He wasn't much for long communications, it said. The council investigation has concluded in 2 of the 5 cases I flagged. Individuals returned to their species. 63 individuals is not so many, but it is 63 more than there were before. I thought you would want to know. I sat with that message for a long time. 63 individuals. 63 people who had been taken, who had been referred to as developmental stage individuals in protocol documents, who had been processed as tribute, who had been separated from the people who would have, in any other circumstance, built walls to protect them. 63 was not a large number in the context of galactic populations. I knew that. I also knew that each of those 63 was someone's child, someone's particular, irreplaceable, 9-year-old obsessed with octopuses child. I wrote back thank you for all of it. He didn't reply, but I didn't need him to. I went back to Earth about 3 months after the Veth Caros incident, first real leave I'd taken in about 2 years. I went to see my brother's family in Porto. His kids were 11 and 7, Mia and Daniel. I'd last seen them at Christmas 2 years before. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. My brother met me at the airport and drove me back to their house, and his kids were in the garden when we pulled in. And the moment Mia spotted the car, she ran toward it, and I got out, and she launched herself at me, 11 years old, all elbows and enthusiasm, and I caught her, and stood there in my brother's garden in Porto in the October sun with this kid wrapped around me, telling me at high speed about her volleyball tournament, and a documentary she'd watched about ancient Rome, and a fight she'd had with Daniel, and the name of their new neighbor's dog. I listened to all of it. I stood there in the garden with this particular, irreplaceable child talking into my ear, and the October light was warm, and somewhere in the house Daniel was shouting for someone to come look at something, and my brother was already heading inside to see what it was, and the neighbor's dog, whose name was apparently Batata, was visible over the garden wall, and it was. It was just a normal Friday afternoon. Just a completely ordinary, beautiful, unremarkable human afternoon. And I thought about Vaughn's face going gray. I thought about Hargrove and the wall and the coffee and the octopuses. I thought about 63 people going home. I held my niece a little tighter for a moment. She didn't notice. She was still talking about Batata the dog. I'm glad she didn't notice. The official record of the Veth Caros incident takes up about 40 pages in the Human Galactic Affairs Archive. It describes the fleet arrival, the demands, the legal proceedings, the council resolution. It's accurate. It's thorough. It covers the facts. What it doesn't cover, what official records never quite cover, is what it felt like to be in that room when Sato handed me the tablet. To read those words, 20 individuals, 8 to 14 years. What it doesn't cover is the quality of silence in a room full of trained, professional people who have built careers around not reacting, and then briefly, for just a moment, react. What it doesn't cover is what humans are when you try to take our children. Not the diplomatic version, not the legal version, not the version that goes in a council archive. The real version. The version that has been true since before we built the first wall, since before we had language for it, since before we had a word for love or loss or the particular fierce warmth that kindles in the chest when you hold someone small and understand in your bones that there is nothing you would not do. The Velthari thought they were doing an accounting, Veth Caros, what is owed by the lesser to the greater, the calculation of debt and submission and hierarchy. They didn't know what we were calculating. They found out. General Vaughn went pale, or as close to pale as a Velthari general gets. I watched it happen, through a screen across a distance, and I understood it. I understood what he had seen in those operational records, in those 9 minutes, in the files about humans under threat. He saw what we become. And honestly, I'm not sure he was wrong to go pale. Not because we're violent, not because we're dangerous in some simple, straightforward way, but because there is a kind of love that doesn't bend and doesn't calculate and doesn't run the numbers on whether resistance is viable. It just is. And when you meet it for the first time, when you look into the face of it across a diplomatic channel and understand that this is not fear talking, not bravado talking, not tactical maneuvering talking, it is something else entirely, something older and realer than any of those things. I think you'd go pale too. I think anyone would. Sarath Voss eventually left Velthari diplomatic service entirely, about 2 years after the incident. He took a position with a joint species research cooperative studying cross-cultural cognitive frameworks, which is a very academic way of describing the work of trying to understand why different species think so differently about the same things. He reached out to me when he made the change. Short message again, just, I am trying to understand something. I think it will take a long time. I wrote back, most of the things worth understanding do. He's still at it, last I heard. Good. The galaxy needs more people of whatever species who are willing to sit with the hard questions. Mia is 14 now. She's still tall, still all elbows, currently obsessed with ancient Egyptian architecture instead of Rome, and she started playing guitar badly and enthusiastically, which I'm told is a phase all kids go through. Hargrove's daughter is 12 and has moved from octopuses to deep-sea fish in general, which her mother considers an acceptable escalation. The wall still stands. It always does. Not built from stone or steel or orbital stations, built from something older than any of those. We build it every day without even thinking about it, without even noticing. That's the thing about love as a force of nature. It doesn't require awareness to function. It just works. And that, in the end, is what General Orith Vaughn of the Velthari Empire learned on a Tuesday in October, 400 kilometers above the North Atlantic, with the cold dark of space on all sides and 17 ships behind him. He learned what we are. He went pale. And he went home,